Alright, so here you have your grout lines nice and tight, but one thing I want you to be aware of is that the tiles are not always the same sizes. So making sure that you leave space for grout line, barely much at all, will allow you to deal with the discrepancies. Some of the tiles will be an 1/8 to 3/16 bigger. So if you try to keep them super tight, you'll end up running into issues where you're over. So you can see right here, you're about 1/8 over. That'll play heck on your lines. So the biggest thing is to forget, now that you have your layout done, forget that your lines exist. Set up a laser to try to hit your points, and then you're just going to try to keep them floating around the same. So for instance, right here you're close to your line, and over here you're not. So you would actually just kind of help float your tiles towards your lines, try to help, and there'll be some areas that'll have big gaps and some areas that have small gaps, and that'll give that texture look. Because if you stick with this super tight pattern, and then as you go, it could increase, throwing you way off. Then you'd have an area that has tight grout lines, and then another area that doesn't have any, or has a lot of grout lines. So just go ahead and add yourself a little bit in, and allow yourself a little bit of room to play, even if it's such like that 1/16 or so. Sometimes it might just be on one side of the tile while you try to line that up. So various different things, but just remember this is more of an art installation versus a tile installation. Most of the time they say do not hire a traditional tile setter, because they generally will always want to make sure it's in line and symmetrical. So just some tips. Another thing, when you're setting corners like this, you have to make sure that you're bringing the one out right, because if not, you'll end up with a balance. So if you set that on the edge, you can see that there's a big gap. And then the same thing when you bring it over here, you'll have a gap here, because the edge is not rotated far enough. In other words, this inner edge is back too far and should have been driven forward much further to bring this out. But the problem with using a double corner like this that's not pre-made is that you're having to make your 90, and so that becomes very difficult. Generally what we do is we'll set this single edge with a stapler, and that's how we can get it to overhang the distance if needed. Or we can put something back here, like a little small block, just to hold it in place while the mortar sets up, especially when you're setting a bunch of tiny tiles. But that's what we do. That's how we generally do it, with a single edge, but either way, it's about learning.